Hello and welcome to the Criticaleye Asia podcast, inspiring leaders to succeed. These podcasts engaging on subjects at the forefront of business leaders' minds. Always topical, thought-provoking, and enabling you to learn from leaders and peers delivering amazing results, unpacking leadership and making it bite-sizable. We're here today to explore stepping up and focus on the global HRD. Very fortunate to help explore this subject with me to be with Till Vestring, who has an expansive portfolio career and sits on a number of listed boards. Till, great to have you here.
Charlie, it's great to be here.
Would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
So I've had a 30-year career in Asia, mainly with Bain Company, which is my original reason for coming out to Asia and where I've worked for many years. I've worked with multinationals, I've worked with Asian companies, family businesses, listed companies, the range, and seen many HR heads in action. I've also, for a number of years, run Bain's business in Asia, in Southeast Asia. And in that capacity, we went through a period of rapid growth and change. And the HR partnership was actually incredibly important because consulting is a people business. And I think over the last couple of years, by being a board member in both listed and unlisted companies, I've had quite a number of close interactions with HRDs. I've also been member or chair of REMCOs and nomination committees, so I've seen them at even closer range. And finally, I've learned quite a bit by being a Criticaleye board member, because I've had a chance to mentor senior Asia-Pacific heads of business, and through their eyes understand about how they think about their team, their business, their people, and the HR issues are easily 30-40% of what we talk about in those conversations.
Till, let's explore your very interesting perspective on this, and in particular, as being an INED, the role of the global HRD and what you have noticed as something that's been good and probably less well done, that's probably held that HRD back. And bearing in mind that we're looking at particularly those individuals who are just stepping into this role and understanding that what goes on at the board level is very, very important.
So as a NED, what do I actually expect from a high-performing HR head? I expect that they are partnering with the CEO and with the broader management team to achieve results. The problem is, how do I know that as an NED? Because I'm not sitting in these discussions. But over time, I think I've realized that there are a couple of telltale signs maybe that show me that the HRD is playing the kind of role that a business today needs. And that is, if the CEO will actively bring in the HRD in key board discussions on people or transformation issues. If the board never sees the HRD and only hears the CEO or maybe a business unit head talk about issues, including people issues, then I know that the HRD is maybe playing a very nice functional role. It's technically strong, but they're not playing that kind of critical advisory role that the business actually needs for them to play. So seeing the HRD in action and the CEO clearly showing respect and being willing to let the HRD front some of the discussions, that's a very good sign that that partnership is working. I would say the second way you can get a sense whether that relationship is working is if, when it comes to, say, turning around a business, putting in major change program, that the CEO will proactively talk about the role of the HRD. So my business unit XYZ needs to be turned around. I've got my HRD working with them to achieve that. And that is because that's so critical to any kind of success. And if the CEO proactively mentions that, I know that there's something good going on in the background. So those are probably the two ways that I get a sense that the HRD is actually playing a very critical role.
I think it's fascinating, that observation, and something that's not necessarily thought about much. What about a point of crisis, which invariably has a human resource element associated with it? Because that is something where you must observe some interesting perspectives as well.
Yes, and the HRD role is actually probably one of the most challenging because we don't really have too many times where we don't have a crisis of one sort of another, right? Whether it's a health crisis, geopolitical, you name it, right? And the HRD is always challenged to play a key role in that. I think when you know that it's going well is when you feel a sense of we've got this under control, but while acknowledging the challenges. Right? So COVID was a great example. So if an HRD would come into a board discussion and say, we've got this under control in April 2020, you would know something was wrong because no one had it under control. Governments didn't have it under control, and certainly HR directors wouldn't have been expected. But if they said, we're trying to work through this, here's what we're doing, we're being very responsive, we're trying to learn as much as possible, then I know that there's a good chance that they'll get this under control eventually. Right? So this sense of realism, I've got this under control, but I'm not oblivious to the challenges that are ahead. That's really important.
It's when things are going well, there's a rhythm. It's though HR is always going to be coming across challenges that they need to alert the board of. What should they be bringing to the board? How should they be doing it?
So you would love to have as a board member is HR being proactive about this. And, all the way from there are a couple of global trends that are going to have a big impact on people, whether it's simple things, seemingly simple things like work from home actually has a major impact on people development. Whether it's migration has a major impact, and on some businesses for sure, whether it's just tough economic environment. So you'd really like for the HRD to be proactive and thoughtful about those topics and be able to articulate to the board, we know that, we're thinking through, we may not have the answers, but we're working on that, and we will deal with it in due course, and we'll come back to the board when we have a program in place, etc. Right? And I fully understand that that's all beyond the HRD's normal day-to-day job, right? Which could be dealing with unions, could be dealing with staff, splitting up bonus, and so on, right? Which is a lot to do already. So having this strategic agenda in mind is actually a big ask.
Another area where the HRD has a key involvement and that you will observe being an INED is on the REMCO. What is it that you look for from an HRD in their capacity, whether it is one of advising or whether it is more directly involved in that committee?
Competence, independence, and willingness to rethink key policies. Let's start with competence. Obviously, you need the HRD to be competent. Yes, if you're a big company, you will have a REMCO advisor, but someone needs to make sure that the REMCO advisor is actually calculating the numbers correctly. And I can't, as a REMCO chair, I have to rely on the numbers. And I don't want to be digging into the spreadsheet to try to figure out why this doesn't make sense. So the HRD is critical for that, and I feel so much better taking on a REMCO chair role if I know that there's a competent HR director, but also that they have a good team that is backing it up. So that's competence. Independence, both the REMCO and the HRD are actually in a tricky position because they are deciding on the remuneration of key executives, as well as the board, actually. But let's start with the key executives. And I've been in REMCOs where, unfortunately, the HRD was very much controlled by the CEO. And that was quite obvious, that they were fighting the CEO's battle. And that's not healthy because it shows that there isn't enough control. So the HRD there, in the best of cases, has the respect of the CEO, but the CEO also understands that they are professional and they have to do this properly and can't be biased when it comes to things like bonus and executive compensation. And that you actually, as a REMCO chair, you pretty quickly get a sense. Also, I get worried if the CEO wants to be in all the REMCO meetings because I know that they're controlling what's being said. And, fair enough. The CEO has critical stake here because it's their people and they need their people to perform and be incented and retained and so on, but to a limit.
Could you give us an example where that delicate position one finds yourself in as an HRD has been managed well? And perhaps also ones, I suppose you referenced less well. What do you think looks great when you are an HRD and have an input to the Remco, and equally in the knowledge that this is something that the board is interested in because they are closely keeping an eye on this area at the moment?
So first of all, if in Remco meetings the CEO doesn't talk all the time and let HRD take the lead, even if they are a member or invited to all the meetings, that's a good sign.
Yeah.
Secondly, I tend to have one-on-one meetings with the HRD in preparation for Remco meetings and sometimes just to get to know the person. So I like to go to lunch with the HRD and ask some questions. And you get a feel for how much alignment there is, how much pressure the HRD gets from the CEO. So if you feel comforted in those discussions that you have someone with, some degree of principle and who is willing, if necessary, to fight for what is right or push back against the CEO, then that makes you feel quite comfortable.
In looking at the role of the HRD and their relationship with the board, in particular the NEDs, the key observation probably is their capacity to be a partner in business. What are your observations of that, and what, from your perspective, is an encouraging element that you find with great HRDs?
I think great HRDs not only execute well on the people agenda, that's clearly critical, but they also shape the debate and they influence the direction of the company and the thinking of the leadership team. If you get to that level, then you are truly a member of that leadership team. And I find HRDs who've had some experience in a business leadership role themselves, doesn't have to be a P&L ownership, but have done something beyond HR at some point in their career, they seem to get it more naturally. Doesn't mean that others don't, but there's this element of thinking like a business person, which I think is very, very important to get the respect and be able to understand and be able to shape the direction of the business.
No, I agree, and I think the other thing is about them being able to step up and shape that agenda. So what would your observation be of where perhaps there isn't that forward-thinking agenda? How can the HRD really step in and influence? And what would you want as an INED in particular for them to be able to undertake?
So I think a good starting point is if the HRD can work with different business heads to understand their business and their challenge and not just wait for direction. Right? So going in and saying, where are you planning to take this business over the next 2 years and how can I be of help? And let's work together. Let's think about the talent agenda. So that's all signs that the HRD is thinking very constructively and forward-looking about the business. I think the second thing that HRDs are uniquely qualified to do is because they tend to be quite well networked with other HRDs. So they know often better than the CEO knows about what's happening in similar types of situations, similar type of companies. And I think bringing that into the business debate is very healthy, right? To say, we know from our HRD network that companies are increasingly looking at AI and productivity, for example, and people are very actively experimenting here. We should be thinking about this, and I have some ideas. Right? That's the kind of stuff that, as a business leader, you'd love to hear from your HRD.
Finally, as an INED, how would you recommend a global HRD engages you? How would you like them to pull you in, and how frequently can they do that? And what's appropriate and probably not as appropriate?
It's somewhat situational because styles differ. I've been on one board where you were not allowed as an NED to have any interactions with any executive without the CEO's explicit permission. And what I found out afterwards is not only did he have to agree, it was a he in this case, I had to ask, he would then also brief the executive very carefully in terms of what they were allowed to say, what they were not allowed to say. That's an extreme example, but that's clearly not healthy. On the other hand, as a NED, I don't want to get calls or emails saying, I need to talk to you. I have something to share. That's not a good sign. That's a bad sign because it means somehow the trust relationship has broken down in the executive team or maybe between the HRD and the CEO. But what you'd like to be able to see is the HRD playing that active role in a board meeting when they are involved, right? They'll not always be involved. And typically the annual kind of talent or succession plan, that's a key one, right? Because that's also where you can see whether the HRD is truly ambitious for the business, right? And has good judgment of people. Because if you've been through several years of those, then you also know the talent that they pointed out 3 years ago, what's actually happened to them? Has that materialized or not? And did the HRD help in bringing that forward?
Till, thank you so very much indeed. I thoroughly enjoyed exploring the perspective you brought, and I think it's extremely important for these HRDs to be extended this insight. So thank you so very much indeed.
It's been a pleasure. As you could hopefully notice, I'm quite passionate about the topic. It's just such an important one. We all know that, but sometimes we don't give it the due attention. And I would love to see HRDs thrive because that creates a successful business.